Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Ethical Perspectives in the News. I am your host, Karl Cassell. On May 25th, 2020, the murder of George Floyd awoke the nation to the often ignored approach of law enforcement in dealing with the citizens of this country. Now, we as a nation are coming to grips with a video of another unarmed, innocent till proven guilty United States citizen, Tyree Nichols, on January 7th, 2023, beat within an inch of his life and die a couple days later in the hospital. Unfortunately, there is a division developing amongst the populace, with many asking for total reform and in some local jurisdictions for a defunding of the police. And the other group holds to a strict stance of unwavering support of law enforcement, despite the often lethal tactics applied to citizens. Today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, we will explore the important topic of police brutality and the effect it has on communities across the nation. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the show today. We have Amara Andrews, President of Advocates for Social Justice. Good morning.
Hi there.
And Alison Bianchi, Director of the Center for the Study of Group Processes at University of Iowa. How are you today?
I'm well. Good morning.
And so let's jump into this very difficult and often uncomfortable conversation that a lot of individuals either choose to stay away from, or we're just yelling over each other. And it's unfortunate that we don't have representation today from law enforcement and or our city council. So we will continue as such. But what do either one of you believe are the root causes of police brutality?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a really complicated discussion and topic, but I think the root cause that I can think of two sort of primary causes, and the first is implicit bias. I think the fact that there are racial stereotypes that are so ingrained in our culture, it's difficult for police officers to not be biased by them. And so there, is a bias and fear of Black people, particularly Black men, that I think is one of the root causes of police brutality and the unfair treatment of Black people. And like I said, particularly Black men. And the other, I think, is the police culture of violence, of, authority, of lethal violence. That is also part of the problem. The tendency to resort to violence instead of de-escalation, combined with bias against Black people, to me is the primary cause of police brutality.
I want to agree with Amara completely on this and add another one, and that is the lack of accountability that we often have in our societal structures surrounding the police departments, unfortunately. I think that that individual police officers are not necessarily held accountable for many of the things they do. I think that that's changing. I think the George Floyd case, I think as a society, certainly we're starting to recognize the need for accountability. But I think the change in police culture, the one that Amara referred to, is slow. And I think this notion of individual police officers, as well as groups of police officers, need to be held accountable for what they do, is there's a lot of pushback of that right now, especially from from the police unions and other aspects of law enforcement that don't want to institute these things. But accountability can save police lives too. And so we need to think about all of the things that Amara is talking about, as well as holding police officers to a certain levels of accountability.
And so, please go ahead, Amara, please.
No, I just would add to this idea of accountability. One of the problems with policing police officers is that it's the police that police officers. And so in order to hold police accountable, there has to be some third party or outside structure that deals with police misconduct. The first entity to review police misconduct usually is internal affairs, and those are police officers. Right. So that's where we see this sort of beginning of a lack of accountability for police officers who are not acting, correctly.
And I was going to mention that. So thank you. The accountability piece is somewhat difficult when the fox is guarding the hen house.
Right.
And so for me, Alison, you talked about, you think it's developing. What does that accountability look like? I do know in this case, specifically the Tyree Nichols case in Memphis, these officers were fired and charged right away. But that seems to be so far and few in between. What does accountability within the system really look like?
Yes, I want to build on what Amara was talking about, is having third parties really intervene, civilian panels, more not just communities understanding and trusting, but being part of the organization of the police force itself, and having that kind of check on behavior and understanding. And we're relying on technology a lot right now for accountability. So for example, police cams, body cams, but technology is often an imperfect accountability system, and certainly body cam footage can be withheld from the community, right? So I think that organizations like Amara is president of could become more involved with the authority structures within departments themselves.
Yeah, and Karl, as you know, in Cedar Rapids, Advocates for Social Justice was instrumental in getting our Citizens Review Board created. And the idea behind a Citizens Review Board is just, like Alison was mentioning, it's for citizens to review police misconduct. But so often Citizens Review Boards are created across the country that really have no power and no authority, and no ability to act. So it's important when creating a Citizens Review Board that you are very well researched, and it's created in a way that's got some teeth, which ours, we worked very hard to enact and to ensure that it did have some sort of authority, but it's a challenge. It's really hard. And our Citizens Review Board currently is not without challenges. I mean, the requirements to sit on the Citizens Review Board are quite daunting. The number of volunteer hours, or training hours, I should say. It's hard to get people to commit to being on the Citizens Review Board because it's exhausting. And in addition, you want to be sure that the members of the board are a cross section of the community, and that too has proven to be difficult. So, it's not easy, but something like a Citizens Review Board is, would help with police accountability. It helps take the hands out of internal affairs and into another body to review police misconduct.
I think that funding of a citizens panel might be, might be a good step too.
Yes, that's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, these are the challenges, and yet, these are the kind of things that I would certainly advocate for as a community member, and the good works that organizations like Amara's do.
So Amara, your group is one that we all can celebrate getting, being used to get some things done here in our local community. But how can communities work together with law enforcement to reduce incidents of police brutality? Of course, our prayer is it never happens in any community, but likelihood of that is slim to none. How do we work to reduce it?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how to turn my blinging off on my computer. I hope you guys aren't hearing that, but you probably are. So, community involvement is really important. Programs like GVI, programs that bridge the gap between community and police officers are really important. Additionally, recruiting community members to serve on the police department is vital. And that's something, at least in Cedar Rapids, that is missing. Many of our police officers don't represent the community in which they serve. And, I think you will find that across the country. So to the extent that police officers look like the people they are protecting and serving, and grew up in those communities, the better we are able to bridge the gap between communities, particularly communities of color, and police officers.
Alison, anything to add?
I really like this idea of recruiting community members to build trust. That's really what's lacking right now between police forces and community members, especially communities of color. Without those kind of social psychological links, it's very, very hard to protect and serve without using compelling force. And so having that kind of community trust is actually a de-escalating situation for police brutality by definition.
And so let's talk about the group dynamics. When we look at what happened to Tyree Nichols, or we can go back to the Rodney King incident and watched a group, what is the psychosis behind a group of individuals? Even you had first responders on the scene allowing this man to literally die or be close to death without any help. What is the psychology behind a group of individuals who are installed with protecting and serving, not doing so?
Right. So I'm going to rely on the research of a very, very famous social psychologist by the name of Philip Zimbardo. He was the individual who conducted the Stanford prison experiments. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, in 1971, this young assistant professor at Stanford University decided to simulate a prison. And so he assigned really nice kids to be prison guards and really nice kids to be prisoners. And after 6 days of that situation, he had to stop the simulation because the guards were literally torturing the with all of the guards were doing some form of torture to the prisoners. And so what Zimbardo found, and he's written a book that is that there are certain aspects of group dynamics that can create the kind of situations that you saw with the Scorpion squad, right? That was directly responsible for Tyrese Nichols' demise. Zimbardo calls it the Lucifer effect. And that is that good people can be overwhelmed by the power of the situation and perform bad acts. In order to do that, you have to have a group dynamic where you have an ideology, a strict ideology of a tight-knit group that dehumanizes the individuals that you're targeting. And there's no question, right? There's no question that African-American civilians are often dehumanized by these police cultures that Amara referred to. And so when you have that, also part of the Lucifer effect in ideology is that the euphemisms and nice words are used to honor almost brutal acts. That the ideology develops such that what you're doing, even though it's really bad, suddenly looks really good because it's in the service of maintaining that group dynamic. That's what I think happened with this particular squad of individuals. And I also, well, we'll get into the racial dynamics of it, but I also just want to add that African-American police officers are not immune to this, right? It can, when you're in the situation, when your adrenaline's pumping, right, and you're in these kind of situations, there's certain parts of your brain that are stimulated the most, and these are the parts that you're not thinking, right? This is not a cognitive thing. It's a group dynamic where you are just acting based on emotion because the adrenaline is so pumping there, right? And so in this kind of group dynamic, violence becomes normalized because it's perceived as not a last resort, but a first resort to do good. I don't have to get into the brains of these individuals that perpetuated these acts on Tyrese Nichols. I can tell by what they were doing that this was the kind of dynamic, unfortunately, that was created. And I'm incredulous that a police department would want to set up groups like this. I don't know where this idea came from. I guess I was pretty uninformed about these squads, these elite squads that are being put into police departments. But quite frankly, this is a military organization, a squad of like a battalion that you would use in the military. And so when people talk about demilitarizing police departments, I want to add to demilitarize using group structures that mimic certain parts of military organizations. They're just not effective for protect and serve procedures.
Amara.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a background in psychology, but it does seem analogous to the military, where you ride or die for your team. You take care of one another, you kill for one another, you do whatever it takes. Similarly, the police is that kind of organization, or seems to be that kind of organization where they, protect one another above all else. Similarly, you could make it analogous to like a gang mentality.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, in these instances where we see groups of police officers beating up on, in some instances, innocent individuals, there can be no other explanation.
Right. It's really, group dynamics are really powerful. I hear a lot when people talk about police officers, oftentimes I hear, even President Biden has said it, that most police officers are really, really good people. And, I kind of believe that. I've actually written letters of recommendation from my students to go to police academies, and thinking to myself, wow, that's the kind of person who I would really like to see be a police officer, an enlightened, educated person, right? But sometimes it's not about the individual. Sometimes it's about the power of the group dynamics that creates these situations where violence becomes normalized. And it's really hard to intervene as another person in the group to say, stop doing that. It's really difficult to set up that dynamic. Now, there's a group of psychologists at Georgetown University that are actually working on a peer intervention strategy that can be used by police officers to be able to stop individuals when they see them in this kind of hyper adrenalized state, to de-escalate everyone so that you could come back to cognition to create, better control of the situation. This might sound counterintuitive, but coming in full force in a situation, you have a higher chance of losing control because of these group and brain dynamics than you do coming in calmly with de-escalation as a group dynamic, right? And so I think that these kind of peer interventions could potentially work, but it's going to require a cultural change. And we know that changing these kind of police cultures is tough.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because a lot of activists, and I'm literally dealing with this now, were perceived as adversaries or as people who, hate police officers. And that couldn't be, that is far from the truth, right? I agree. Most police officers are good people. They go into the police force to protect and serve. So it's not that we think all police are bad, or that we are against police as a blanket statement. What we're against is misconduct. We're against police brutality. And I love the idea of having these sort of interventionists, if you will, police interventionists. And we should, that should be something, that should be a person that is trained whenever you have these sort of group, these sort of police groups. There should be someone that's their role.
Right. And according to this program, it's called the ABLE program, if I could be so bold, the Active Bipartisanship for Law Enforcement program that's being fostered at Georgetown, that they're going to try. I think, again, to create a peer intervention strategies where if somebody intervenes and said, let's de-escalate the situation, it's not seen as some kind of power play or some kind of poke at somebody's identity or even their masculinity. It's just really like a moment. Let's take a moment to assess and do it in a way with a protocol that's really reinforcing of people's good nature. That would, again, it won't just de-escalate the violence against the people in the communities. It might even save lives of police officers.
Absolutely. Well, and this is one of the reasons I wish we would have had a participant from law enforcement on the panel, because I think what we're talking about is proper training. And so I don't know what the training looks like or what it is, but whatever the training is seems to keep producing the same results. Mm-hmm. And I will throw in my personal commentary, because I'm often, when I speak to this subject, you just don't like police. You want the criminals to win. No, I don't like anyone who does crime. I don't care if you wear a uniform or if you don't. The problem becomes is when you speak about those who are tasked with protecting and serving, speak on what they do wrong, you're often, as Amara said, now you're an agitator, or you're someone who doesn't appreciate that they put their lives on the line every day. No, we absolutely appreciate it. But I know historically it becomes a situation where these things are allowed. And so what about the training needs to change? And can groups start helping to, I would say, alter the current level of training, whatever that training is that is producing the hyper or overly aggressive nature in which they deal with citizens? And I put an emphasis on citizens because, again, they are U.S. citizens.
Absolutely. So
Amara, no, you go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on something that you had said earlier about implicit biases.
Mm-hmm.
There are now new protocols. Again, these things are so new; they're being worked out. But I think that there's real promise. There's a researcher who's world famous for a study of implicit bias by the name of Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford University, and she's working with some members of law enforcement to come up with protocols that help people understand their implicit biases and work with, working with different role-playing scenarios, working with more awareness and understanding to help people, overcome these implicit biases. There's a really a famous psychologist too at the University of Colorado by the name of Karl, who does simulation studies of police officers who draw their weapons, and he's coming up with protocols to help police officers stop, using implicit bias in these situations, because his studies actually found that both white and African American officers both will draw their weapons faster for the unarmed African American simulated civilian versus the white simulated civilian. So police officers of color are not immune to these kind of situations either. And so training for everyone, I think, would really, these kind of scenario trainings and understanding of implicit biases is a good place to start.
I agree. Implicit bias training it's wildly important, but not just for lip service, right? I mean, it's got to be quality implicit bias training, but also training in de-escalation, and the demilitarization of policing. There is no reason to draw a weapon at a traffic stop. Or if someone is running away, there's no reason to shoot them unless they pose a threat to others, which most often people don't. So training and de-escalation, I think, is also really, really important and would obviously reduce the incidence of police brutality.
And if I could just add real quickly, demilitarizing group structure.
Yeah,
absolutely. I know we won't have a chance because we're down to our last minute and a half, discuss a solution, I think, which would be, instead of when a civil litigation comes, having it come out of taxpayers and have it come out of the police pension funds, I think, or they have to take out insurance, I think would also change perspective of how quickly they are willing to attack U.S. citizens.
Monetize accountability. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I am so grateful for you two's participation today, and thank you, the viewer, for tuning in. It is evident from our discussion that police brutality is a multifaceted problem with deep roots in systemic racism and a lack of accountability. As we conclude this discussion, I urge us all to reflect on the stories shared by our panelists and the data presented. We must recognize the pain and trauma inflicted on communities of color by police brutality and work to address it with urgency and a commitment to justice. Let us not forget that every victim of police brutality is someone's son, daughter, sibling, or friend. Their lives matter, and it is our duty to ensure that their death or their pain is not in vain. Let us work towards a future where every member of our society, regardless of race, can feel safe and protected by those who are meant to serve and protect them. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Welcome.